As usual, I have a number of topics that I want to cover, and as is true for the last 3 weeks, I want to talk about the subjunctive because it just keeps coming up. There are more and more ways that it comes up. The subjunctive is a grammatical construction. It refers to worlds not in evidence. So if I say, when your grandma gets here, or do you remember your last birthday party, or what can I expect at our meeting tomorrow, or what might happen if I get a flat tire on the way to Flagstaff, these are all subjunctive constructions. They describe worlds not in evidence. The subjunctive is distinguished from the existential. The existential is what is really happening, what really happened, what really exists. So I can hypothesize a rock that I can eat and digest with no consequences to my body. But there is no such rock in existential reality. If it's big enough to be called a rock, it's much too big for me to eat. And if I do try to eat it, I will damage my teeth, I will damage my throat, my esophagus, I will damage my digestive system. Presumably, maybe that will pass through my system, but it will not happen without damage. And so, in that case, I'm invoking a subjunctive condition that cannot possibly exist. And typically, we don't do that. Typically, what we do is we invoke the subjunctive in ways that could exist, might exist, potentially could exist, but don't exist right now. And then the question is the invocation of the subjunctive productive, or is it destructive? Is it destructive of your mental state? And so I've mentioned the idea of dread, because dreading is something that people do habitually. They dread all kinds of things that never will happen, will never, ever, ever happen. And yet they feel that if they don't count all the pennies they don't have, they won't have any pennies. Well, the fact is the pennies that you don't have don't exist, and it doesn't matter how many which ways you count them, they still will not show up in your pocket. They won't be there. If you want pennies in your pocket, you need to be thinking about what you could and should be doing to generate income, not thinking about all of the different ways that you could not generate income, or that you could lose the money that you have, or that things could go wrong. Anything could go wrong. It's completely plausible. There is a degree to which dread can be valuable. And so I mentioned, what happens if I get a flat tire when I'm driving to Flagstaff? Well, if I drive from Phoenix to Flagstaff, I'm driving through a whole lot of desert, and this has happened to us. We've broken down on the way to Flagstaff and spent 4 hours out in the middle of the day, in the middle of the summer, in the heat of the desert, hot, inadequate supply of water, cell phones not working because we're so far out in the middle of nowhere, nothing to eat except leftover peppermints given out by Mexican restaurants, waiting first for a cop to come along, and the cop is covering hundreds of square miles of territory, and so it was forever for him to come to us, and then he was able to radio in to get AAA to come out and deal with us, and we're waiting another couple of hours for that. This could happen, and so were we well prepared? We were not. We were not. Unfortunately, it was just me and Kathleen, my wife, just two adults, and we were prepared enough. We were fine for the situation that we were in, but suppose we had had an infant in the car. Not a baby, not a child, not a toddler, but an actual infant, 6 days old, 10 days old, 14 days old. Would we have been adequately prepared? No. And that infant could have suffered serious health consequences and maybe even death because we were unprepared. And that's a case where taking account of your dreads, briefly, you don't indulge them, you don't waste hours pondering every possible impossibility that might befall you, but anything that you can address productively, you need to think about and address it, because if you don't, then you could be inducing a permanent regret in your life. And as I said last week, regret is something to be avoided. If it's possible for you to anticipate a problem and address it in advance, then this is the right thing to do, because the dread will be forever. If you fail to do this, you thought about it, you say, oh, well, I guess I don't need to worry about that. If you really need to worry about it, then do worry about it and do deal with it, because if you don't, the regret will be terminal. It will be with you till you die. And that's the kind of thing that you want to avoid. A lot of the errors that people make with the subjunctive, I would call errors of idealization, errors of fantasy. The nirvana fallacy is the name for this in the form of logical fallacies. And what it basically consists of is postulating conditions that are not in evidence, that don't really exist, and then reasoning about those postulations. And so the classic joke of this is two mathematicians stranded on a desert island, and a can of soup washes ashore, and one of them looks to the other and says, "First, we postulate a can opener." And it's funny because obviously they don't have a can opener, and postulating a can opener won't do any good. You will not open a can with a postulated can opener. And this is the kind of thing that we do all the time, is that we are so eager to validate some idea that we have, to conclude that our reasoning is correct, that we fantasize, we idealize a circumstance not in evidence, and then regard that as being dispositive, as being something that will enable us to have what we can't have. Well, all the imaginary cookies in the world will not fill your belly. And so imagining a cookie, or imagining a dozen cookies, or imagining a whole room full of cookies, it doesn't really matter, because they're all 100% imaginary. They don't exist. They can't fill your belly. And this is a kind of an error that you need to watch for. Another one that I run into all the time, I call it the yeah but fallacy. I will make an argument, and if you have read Man Alive, you have seen the kind of arguments that I can make. I make bulletproof arguments. I go out of my way to make bulletproof arguments, and I've been doing this for 33 years. I've gotten good at it. But I will make what I consider to be a bulletproof argument, and there's always room for quibbling, and I really hate quibbling. I mean, I really hate it, because it is a complete waste of my time. And that's what we get with the yeah-but fallacy. Yeah-but says, yeah, I concede, you're right, but I want to quibble anyway. Well, everything before the comma in a yeah-but is a concession, and everything after the comma in that yeah-but is a quibble. And my answer to this problem, I've run into it all my life, and my answer to it is to take the concession graciously, thank you so much for agreeing with me, and ignore the quibbles entirely. They're your problem. You work it out. Because if we got the yeah, if we got the concession, then the argument that I've made is correct. Not just substantially correct, it is correct. I have told you the truth, and you have agreed that it's the truth. And if you're attempting to quibble after that, then that's a personal problem. That's just something you need to work out on your own. It's probably emotional. It's probably just a matter of disquiet. And the disquiet is probably originating in your appetites rather than in your reasoning. But it really doesn't matter to me, because we have nothing left to argue about. You've already conceded the case. The purpose of going through all of this and to talk about the subjunctive in as many different ways as I can is because the subjunctive is the easiest path to error in human cognition. It is a path to truth, and it is very useful as a path to truth. But you have to go through in your mind every possible way that you can arrive at an error by invoking worlds not in evidence, and if you don't do that, then chances are excellent that you're going to make mistakes. And I have cited logical fallacies. I think probably 2 Sundays ago I linked to 3 or 4 sites that document logical fallacies, and this is my advice to you. Big picture advice. One of the best things you can do for your mind is to study the logical fallacies in detail. I mean, do one a day if you need to. Really do it. And then look for it, and look for it in the things that you read, the things that you see online. Look for those logical fallacies, but just master them. Really learn how to identify errors in other people's arguments. And you still might make mistakes in your own arguments. I know I do. I've done it many times where I have made a specious argument and only months later realized, wow, that was a bogus argument. That was really terrible. There is no escaping. Selection bias is what it is, that you're always happy to agree with yourself. There is no way around that except by being rigorously careful. But the way that you become more rigorously careful is by learning the habits of rigor, learning how to manage your mind better, to do a better job of identifying errors in general, and you will do, in consequence, a much better job of identifying errors in your own arguments.